Welcome everyone, Questine here on Serious Gaming with my top 5 heroic dungeon list for World of Warcraft The Burning Crusade Classic for what I expect will be the best heroic dungeons to farm Badges of Justice from. Now, Badges of Justice are pretty important for a lot of people, and not just for regular gear, there's also resistance gear. Early on, you will want one Warlock to get a full set of fire resistance to be able to do a boss like Leofras, and then later on, Kael'thas. Once you get to tier 6, you will want tanks to have full fire resistance set for Ephron and Mount Hyjal, and also for Illidan himself. And on top of that, with patch 2.3, which is Zolomon, and actually even with 2.1, and of course with Sunwell Plateau, you also get plenty of badge gear. So, Badges of Justice, there's plenty of them to farm. There's hundreds potentially of Badges of Justice that you might want to farm, especially when Blizzard adds epic gems with the Sunwell Plateau for Badges of Justice. They will be in demand. And these are, as far as I'm concerned, the 5 best dungeons in the game to farm them from. Now, I want to give an honorable mention to Akanai Crypt's Heroic. It only gives you 2 Badges of Justice, so it doesn't really quite make the list. But if you have a decent group, and keep in mind, I'm talking here from the perspective of dungeons that you will be grinding over and over again, even grinding when you will have full raid gear, because you will care about Badges of Justice throughout the entire game, at least dependent on your class. So I assume that people will have decent gear when doing this. Akanai Crypts, even with early game gear, is a pretty easy dungeon to do. You can reasonably do it in less than 20 minutes, hell, even about 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes or so if you have a pretty good group. And sure, it's only 2 Badges of Justice, but it can be pretty quick. It can be pretty painless, dependent on your group, if you have a good enough group to make it so. But even if you don't have the most ideal group, it isn't a hard dungeon, and it's very rare to see a group fail in this place. It takes a dismal amount of failure to screw it up in this particular dungeon, and so I just want to give it a particular shout out. Now, in terms of the top 5 list, and number 5, and here I kind of struggled a bit with the decision, I would say Shadow Labyrinth Heroic, with a caveat. There is some annoying trash and an annoying boss. I would say difficult, but just an annoying boss in this place. In terms of the annoying trash, basically everything up to the second boss, in particular the second boss room, the Fel guards that are in the room before that, and the rogues that will spawn once you kill the first boss, so you can skip dealing with them if you just skip doing the first boss and just go for the second boss and then deal with the first boss. But when you combine all these things, the trash, the rogues, the Fel guards, the second boss, it can be pretty frustrating. It can also be fairly long. But here's the thing. Outside of those particular aspects, if you can kill the second boss, you can clear the rest of the dungeon with ease. And you walk away with 4 Badges of Justice. And Shadow Labyrinth will be a dungeon in high demand, because it's a good way to get exalted with the lower city. And even beyond that, there's gear here, especially from a healer perspective, and even from other people's perspective, there's plenty of gear in Shadow Labyrinth that people want, be it the caster neck from the second boss, or it drops on normal. But hey, why do a dungeon on normal when you can do it on heroic? It's a bit more difficult, but you certainly clear it on heroic and get the same chance at the same loot, and obviously get Badges of Justice, Primal Nether, and the heroic specific gear and gems on top of that. So I would say Shadow Labyrinth earns the top 5 spot. As an alternative, you could also look at Hellfire Ramparts. Now, I don't like including Ramparts on this list because I've been through from retail to private servers. I've seen the issue where the final boss can be fairly tricky, can wipe plenty of groups, and even if you do kill him, you might get the situation where the final boss chest is bugged, so you don't get the Badge of Justice from it. And I've certainly had that situation on my hands on both retail and on private servers, so that's why I wouldn't include Hellfire Ramparts. If it's not bugged, you might consider it as an alternative here, and certainly something that could be considered. But it was a bit of a tricky decision with the number 5 spot, and honestly, Shadow Labyrinth gets on the list because, honestly, lack of alternatives. What else could you include? Not the Mechanar dungeons, not the Hellfire Citadel dungeons, with the exception of Ramparts, certainly not the Caverns of Times ones, because those can be pretty annoying. Regardless if you're talking about Durnhold, which is a fairly hard dungeon, or Black Morass, which isn't hard, but pretty bloody annoying, and honestly not worth the time investment. So, Shadow Labyrinth it is. And number 4, we have Underbog Heroic. All of the Cenarian Expedition dungeons, the Serpentine Caverns dungeons, the Coilfang Reservoir dungeons, that is, are fairly easy, and you'll find decent groups for all of them. Now, the only difficult things in Underbog are the first boss Trash, the second boss, and then the third boss. Everything else is pretty much a cakewalk, and it's not like the Trash, the first boss, is difficult. The only things that might slow you down or stop you are the second boss, which can do quite a bit of tank damage, or the third boss with his ridiculous aim shot and annoying mechanics. But it's not a hard dungeon. It can be a bit lengthy, but you can walk away with 4 badges of justice. And here's the thing. Plenty of people will want to do this place because it is a good source of badges, and it's like, hey, I want to get, let's say, a good amount of badges of justice. Okay, let's just do all the Coilfang Reservoir ones, and we can walk away with 10 if we do so. So you can get pretty decent groups that will be running these dungeons, this dungeon and the other ones, quite often, and you will walk away with quite a lot of badges of justice. I'm putting it at a number 4 spot because it is trickier and it's lengthier. But at number 3, we have Steamvaults. Steamvaults, easy dungeon, easy Trash, easy bosses. The second boss is the only exception to that rule. Outside of that, it's a dungeon you can do pretty quickly, and you might encounter some issues very early on with 2 bog overlords that you will encounter very close to the entrance. But outside of that, it's a quick dungeon. It does require you to skip some of the Trash to make it pretty quick, but the bosses aren't anything to write home about, and it's one of those places, or one of those dungeons where people want the normal loot, but it's so easy on Heroic compared to normal that plenty of people would just jump on the chance once they get their reputation to just do it on Heroic because, hey, extra gems, badges, and extra loot. Heroic only loot, so why not do it on Heroic compared to doing it in normal? That's the thinking, and that's what you're going to get with Steamvaults. Pretty quick dungeon. The only thing that would stop you, genuinely could stop you, is the second boss. That can be a bit of a pain to deal with, but outside that, there's nothing special about this place. And number 2, and in terms of practicality, this could very well earn the number 1 spot. It would have to be Slave Pen's Heroic. Now, the reason this dungeon is so far up on this list is because plenty of people will want to do this place over and over and over again, caster DPS in particular, because they have a trinket from the final boss that pretty much every mage and every warlock wants to get their hands on. It's not the best thing in the world, but plenty of people do desire it, and so you will find no shortage of groups to be doing this particular dungeon. Now, the first boss and the Trash to the first boss, pretty much a joke. The second boss, however, can be a bit tricky. The third boss, not much to write home about, but the Trash can be tricky. So the difficulty here does certainly go higher than something like Steamvaults. I'd say it is more difficult than Steamvaults is to do, but because you're getting better groups, because of the dungeon skips that are available in this place, I'd certainly put it higher on the list. Just from a practical standpoint, it is going to be a lot easier to find a group for Slave Pens than pretty much most other dungeons in the game, with perhaps the exception of Alkanite Crypt's Heroic, and even then only to a particular point. So Slave Pen certainly earns its spot on this list. Finally, at number 1, Mechanar Heroic. Now, this is because of difficulty or ease of access or ease of finding groups, but because of the peculiarities of this particular dungeon. The first boss can be a bit annoying, but not too much of a challenge. The second boss can be certainly a challenge, and the final boss has a fairly frustrating gauntlet to deal with before we actually tackle the boss, with pretty much no rest time between free waves of ads. So you get a set of free waves of ads, then you can take a break, then you get another set of another 3 waves, and then you get the final boss. And you may be able to rest or not, dependent on how Blizzard ends up handling that. But the important thing about Mechanar is not because of its difficulty, it's not because of ease of access. In fact, the Shatar reputation is probably the hardest reputation to get revered in the game, and the one that people are going to be slow on. But here's the catch. You have 2 mini bosses in this particular dungeon that each drop a badge of justice. So even in the worst case scenario, you make a group for this dungeon, it only clears those 2 mini bosses and the first boss, you're still walking away with 3 badges of justice. And you can walk away with 5. And it's certainly not lengthier than some other dungeons in the game, be it on normal or heroic. So it's absolutely not the fastest, but it's easily, as far as I'm concerned, the most profitable dungeon to do in terms of farming badges of justice. If you're seeking to farm a lot of badges of justice, you should be doing Mechanar Heroic daily. It can be tricky, it can be annoying, you may wipe quite a bit, but it's absolutely worth doing if you're interested in, say, farming 100 badges of justice or more. And these are pretty much my thoughts on the subject. Please give me yours in the comment section below, and stay tuned for more. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications.